everyone. Coming up now, we have our first panel discussion of the day. We have some incredible panelists who are going to be talking about the global harmonization for cellular agriculture regulations. And our panelists are Peter Yu, who is Program Manager at APAC Society for Cellular Agriculture. We have Noreen Habayan, who is Director of Quality and Regulatory Affairs at Blue Nalu. And the panel will be moderated by Robert E. Jones, who is President at Cellular Agriculture Europe. So, Robert, I am going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Beth. I appreciate it. I'm really honored to be here today to lead this conversation, but it's very much a group conversation. I'd love to give a formal introduction to our panelists as well. Just add to who I am, Robert Jones. In addition to serving as president of Cellular Agriculture Europe, I have the great honor of being vice president of MOSA Meat and leading global public affairs and working on our regulatory approval around the world. Joining us today are two folks I'm proud to call friends as well. Peter, again, is the manager of APAC SCA, and that is an industry association of 10 plus cultivated meat and seafood companies around the APAC region. Peter works to promote the industry through the establishment of efficient and transparent regulation and policies. He also serves as co-chair of Enterprise Singapore Pro Tem Committee for setting novel food standards and has been a convener for the first MOU in the region on nomenclature. Moreover, Peter has been appointed as a technical expert to the FAO and WHO on safety guidelines for the industry, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Peter has an MBA from the National University of Singapore, a master's in science and bioengineering, and a bachelor's in science and marine biology from the University of Hawaii. Thanks for joining us, Peter. Noreen Habayan is the Director of Quality and Regulatory Affairs at Blue Nalu in San Diego. In this capacity, Noreen is responsible for implementing the FDA FDA compliant quality management systems to ensure safe and consistent production of cell cultured seafood. In addition, Noreen leads Blue Nalu's regulatory approval strategy in the US, Asia, and Europe. And she serves as vice president of the Association for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, AMPS, which we're going to talk about today. She's also an external advisory board member for the Cultivated Meat Research Program at the University of California, Davis, and has spoken about cell cultured seafood safety at numerous professional conferences around the world. All in all, she has 30 years of combined experience in quality assurance, regulatory affairs, and FDA-regulated industries, and holds a bachelor's in science and life sciences from Penn State, a master's in science and quality assurance from California State University, and if she didn't have enough to do, she's pursuing a doctoral degree in organizational leadership from Carolina University. Thank you both.
Thank you, Robert.
So we're going to have a robust conversation today about the topic of harmonization, but it might be helpful for our audience first to get a little bit of context about how these three associations that we represent came together. And earlier this year, we had a formal announcement from Cellular Agriculture Europe, from APAC SCA, and AMPS Innovation in the US, that we were going to begin to coordinate and collaborate on shared challenges and opportunities in this industry. And I think it might be interesting to hear first, maybe from Peter. APAC SCA represents the largest geographic region in the world. You by far represent the most potential consumers for this new industry. Why would you add more to your already long to-do list and begin to work with the Europe and US as well?
Thank you, Robert. I think that's a great question, and thank you so much for the introduction. I think really the Global Alliance has the potential to grow into something really great. After working for the industry for a while and running the association here, I realized really that essentially, collaboration, coordination, and synergy is the way forward. I believe, by the idea behind the Global Alliance and the tenets that we sort of set forth to produce, right? One is to work on synergy regarding cross-border information sharing, regulatory coordination, and coordination in general terms of statements collectively, right? Yes, an industry association collectively. So I think it's really a great platform to start. I feel really privileged to have taken part in creating it. There are common sorts of challenges, but also goals that needs to be either tackled or accomplished, right? And in my opinion, it's the right path forward. And when you want to build really an industry from the roots, I think you can't do that in isolation. It requires everybody to join on board and to make sure that the cultivated food industry will thrive into the future. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be here and engage further in the discussion. And thank you, Robert, for inviting us.
You're welcome. Noreen, a similar question. Why would AMPS, and all the U.S. companies involved in AMPS be willing to join forces with competitors in other geographies?
Hi, Robert. Thanks for that question. Thanks also for the introduction. I'm excited to be here. So why would we want to join with competitors in other countries? So I think that what we're advocating for is a safe way to assess these products, and I think from that perspective, we're not competitors. So I think it's important for us to join forces when it comes to regulatory pathways and assessing safety. I don't see us as competitors. And it really can help us globally to bring these products to market if we're working together, understanding what the issues are and being able to come up with solutions together. So I think that the Global Alliance can help all of the companies advance what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I often refer to us as pre-competitive. Right. I mean, we have to have access and create a market first, and then we can duke it out in the grocery stores and restaurants for, who's got the best product. You mentioned the regulatory pathways and getting there in the first place. So I think it might be helpful for the audience to maybe do a little round robin and talk about the basic regulatory structures as we understand them right now. In the different geographies that our three associations represent. Noreen, I think I'll start with you, and maybe you can give us an overview of what we know about the cellular agriculture regulatory structure in the U.S. so far.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm part of AMPS, and AMPS is really solely focused on the United States. So our member companies, what we have in common is that we all have a physical presence in the U.S., and we're all planning to commercialize these products at some point in the future in the U.S. So in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration and the USDA share joint responsibility for regulation of food. And they've been super proactive when it comes to regulating these kind of products. So back in as early as 2018, I believe it was, they held a public meeting where they looked for comments. And then in 2019, they came up with a joint regulatory framework. So USDA and FDA would share responsibilities. So this is kind of a unique approach, but it's really, I think, what's necessary. So in this agreement, the FDA is overseeing cell collection, cell banks, and cell growth and differentiation. And then they transition oversight to the USDA FSIS, which is the Food Safety Inspection Service, after harvesting. So they'll oversee the further production and labeling of meat and poultry products. And then at the same time, the FDA will maintain jurisdiction over seafood. So it's a very unique approach. And what it does is it mimics what happens now in terms of meat and seafood. So in the US, the FDA regulates live animals up until the point they're used as food. So when they're presented for slaughter, the USDA takes over the authority. So we have the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and we also have the Poultry Products Inspection Act. So the regulation for cell cultured foods will follow the same framework. So in that framework, FDA is responsible for overseeing the pre-market approval. And in this case, we have something that they set up called the pre-market consultation. So in the pre-market consultation process, the FDA is going to evaluate the safety of food made from cultured animal cells before it enters the market. And the process allows the cell cultured meat and seafood companies to work with the FDA on a product by product basis. And it helps inform the FDA of the issues that they have to consider to produce the food safely. So as part of that, FDA also evaluates the production process and the cell culture material made by that process, and as well as the establishment of the cell lines, the manufacturing controls and components and inputs. So it's very similar to what you might see in a novel foods process in another country. And so far, FDA has been very supportive with this consultation process, and they've encouraged firms to come and have conversations with them early and often. And they've engaged in discussions with multiple firms with various types of products, and they will be making as much information as public as possible once the consultations are complete. And then another area that they've been working on is labeling. So how the products will be labeled in the US has not been determined, but FDA and USDA are committed to establishing what they're calling joint principles. And they both requested public comment. So FDA issued a request for information, and USDA published what they call an advance notice for public rulemaking. And the comments that the public made are currently under review by USDA and FDA. And so we expect to hear something shortly about labeling in the form of rules and guidance. And something very exciting in the US is that we had the first cell culture consultation process was completed, and FDA announced that they accept Upside Foods' conclusion that their cell cultured chicken was safe to eat, which was very exciting. But in this case, as I mentioned, chicken is also overseen by the USDA, so they have a couple more regulatory hurdles to overcome in that that framework before they can actually bring it to market. But it's very, very exciting news.
Yeah. Thank you for that rundown. That's very comprehensive. And yeah, I mean, again, coming back to being pre-competitive, I think every company in the world was super excited to see the FDA announcement about Upside, in part because it added another highly credible regulatory body affirming the safety of these products. Because up until now, as we all know, there had only been one regulatory authority who'd really ruled in on this, which is probably a good transition to you, Peter, to give us a rundown on APAC and what we know about the existing regulatory structure.
Thanks, Robert, and thank you, Noreen. I think in comparison to sort of US and EU, APAC, there are many different countries here that are not co-jointly regulated under sort of one umbrella. So there's quite a bit to uncover. So apologies in advance for sort of a lengthy response, but maybe I can begin with Singapore, which everyone knows have a regulatory framework in place specific to novel foods or alternative proteins with inclusion of cultivated foods specifically. First in the world in that regards, this is a framework that is governed by the Singapore Food Agency, have been in place since 2019 with regular updates and amendments on a sort of a rolling basis. In general terms, right, SFA seeks a pre-market assessment regarding novel foods. Companies need to submit a dossier with information regarding toxicity, allergenicity, safety, production methods, dietary exposure, and so forth. Provide information regarding material utilized, control manufacturing processes. So essentially, a holistic and comprehensive review to ensure the safety of the food products. Naturally, all of this information is readily available online. SFA has also formed a novel food safety working expert group in 2020 to provide scientific advice on the matter. So these are comprised of the experts in various disciplines encompassed by the framework itself, right? So regarding the nomenclature and labeling, I think SFA is quite flexible in that sense that you have to clearly, you have to clearly define the food at hand. So terms like cultured, cultivated, or cell-based should all be viable options here, to my understanding, as a qualifying word. But what I think is good about the framework, maybe it's a personal opinion, but it is streamlined. It's clear, flowchart diagrams. It's self-explanatory in that regards. It specifically deals with the unique concept that sort of underlies the production of cultivated food itself, rather than being an umbrella across all novel foods, which I think it becomes quite relevant looking at the other frameworks out there. So naturally, everything can be improved further, but SFA in general has been really receptive to working with industry partners like APAC and taking questions, putting forth amendments and updating in the current framework. So in Singapore, we also have that's part about Singapore, but we have an initiative called FRESH, or the Future Ready Food Safety Hub, which is a tripartite function between A*STAR, Nanyang Technological University, and SFA. So essentially, they assist on the applications, the formulation, sort of formulating a pathway to clear any regulatory hurdle. So Henceforth, this is driven by the government agencies themselves. So we have good support here for a pathway of regulatory efficiency. Briefly, other regions include China, which are really focusing in 2023 on the safety assessment protocols for cultivated food industry, which will most likely be regulated under CFCA, which is the China National Center for Safety Risk Assessment. There has been discussions between industry players in China to assist in the development, and it's currently being undertaken. I know that the Chinese and the U.S. Regulatory experts have been discussing, and they met in regards to the wake of the U.S. FDA approval of the website. So we're waiting with excitement for China 2023, and a follow-up to the Chinese agricultural national 5-year agenda, right? Which as of the last iteration first included cultivated food for the first time. And I think if you look into the general trend here in Asia, where China, Japan, Korea, Israel, to name a few, these countries have really gained a level of commitment from the government to further the development of the industry, to which regulation is really at the forefront. Just, I think, a day or two maybe ago, there was the Japanese Prime Minister, right, Kishida, who touted the importance of the industry regarding sustainable food supplies and the importance of creating a new market and clear guidance, especially in safety and labeling in Japan. So we're experiencing more and more of this kind of news and positive information in the region, and in general support to push further. Last, really briefly, I think I mentioned about Korea, which is a really interesting place to explore, and without going into specific detail, but they just released an MOU, which I probably will expand upon later on, but it encompasses a multitude of stakeholders in the industry for the engagement and partnership to sort of holistically develop the cultivated food industry there. And there will be a special legislative zone to which the companies can sell their cultivated food products prior to any regulatory approval. So sort of like a test market, which I think is really an interesting, great initiative, which I might elaborate a bit more later on as well. But the MFDSD, or the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety, have amended to certain food specification standards as well a few months ago to recognize cultivated foods for the first time as subcategory proteins, with certain stipulations regarding weight by weight, content, production, and measurement to qualify. So regarding the framework in Korea, it most likely resemble that of EFSA. So maybe I think that's a good transition into Robert.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. So we'll get back to where the exciting zones around the world in a second, but a little brief on Europe in terms of our region that we're mainly focused on, which Cellular Agriculture Europe is made up of, again, 14 companies across Europe and Israel. But we're not just focused on the EU proper. We're engaged in the United Kingdom and non-EU states as well, like Switzerland. Looking at the EU first, I think many people are probably familiar, but the novel foods law that is on the books in Europe exists for many years, and it was last updated in 2018. And so the nice thing about Europe is that there's a very clear pathway for these sorts of foods, and they've envisioned bringing new foods like this on to the market for many years. The challenge is that the process is designed to move slow because it's broken into two parts, very clear parts. There's the risk assessment by the European Food Safety Authority, which is fairly standard. If you get down to the nitty gritty, the comparison and risk assessment, even to Singapore and other places, is very similar. Now, where there are procedural differences is that unlike in Singapore, as you described, if the SFA has questions about the dossier or your analysis, they can inquire and have dialogue with you while the rest of the dossier is still being examined and moving forward in the process. Whereas in Europe, if EFSA has questions about your dossier and application, they will formally stop the clock, and all work on the dossier stops. And it's fairly standard to add 3, 6, 9 months to the time. So you can go from a 9-month risk assessment to 18 months fairly quickly, which is one of the reasons that I think many companies have really taken a great opportunity to learn from regulators in other regions to better understand what the EFSA would be looking for, because there's not the pre-consultation dialogue opportunity that you have in Europe that you have in other regions, like you described, Noreen, with the FDA and USDA and in Singapore. But that said, the process is very clear. Once you get a positive safety review or a safety review from EFSA, it's moved back to the European Commission, which has authority over authorizing the product and adding it to the Union food list, the approved list of novel foods. The risk management phase, authorization, is where a little bit more of the politics seep into the process, because there's a standing committee in the European Commission called the Plant, Animal, Food and Feed Committee, or PAF for short. And there's civil servants with food safety experience from all 27 member states in Europe who have representation on the PAF committee. And the PAF committee will present a draft implementing act that will be voted on, and that would dictate sort of conditions of use and things like labeling and nomenclature. And so there's really, to get an approval in Europe, you have to not just work at the EU level, you have to really understand the politics nation by nation and the viewpoint on these new foods. And the whole process altogether, if it goes smoothly, is about 1.5 to 2.5 years. And post-Brexit, right now, the UK has continued to carry over the novel foods law. And the risk assessment in the UK is exactly the same. They'll even give you the EFSA guidance document if you're seeking an approval in the UK. But the risk management side post-Brexit right now theoretically would be smoother because you have one country approving authorization, which is technically split across the 3 ministers of health and social welfare across the 3 entities in the United Kingdom. But there's not yet been an application submitted in either EFSA or the UK. So we've yet to sort of pressure test that process yet. So I think that's the overview, and those are the regulatory structures as we understand them right now around the world. But there's so much activity happening, partly triggered by Singapore, partly a catalyst, a turbocharged catalyst from the recent news out of the FDA. So maybe, Noreen, give us a rundown on some of the exciting new things happening in the U.S. I think there's been an executive order. There's all sorts of things happening.
Sure, there's a couple of exciting things that have happened recently in the U.S. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the reorganization that the FDA commissioner announced in January. So, the FDA gets a lot of criticism, and one of the pieces of criticism is that there's too much focus on the D in FDA. So there's more resources, time, and energy focused on the drug aspects and not enough on the food. Before I say anything about FDA, I personally have seen FDA grow and modernize, and the regulations improve dramatically over the course of my career. So there's always opportunities for improvement, and I'm happy to see that the commissioner has called for reorganization. But I think in general, they're doing an excellent job in trying to modernize along with the industry. But there's some things that have happened recently. I know the infant formula crisis was really well publicized in the US, and it really revealed some weaknesses in the FDA. So in January, the commissioner revealed that his program, or his proposal to revamp the FDA and creating what he's calling the Human Foods Program. And the benefit of that would be to take some of the existing offices that are under the FDA and put them under one head. And it's a good idea because it will help elevate the program and reduce some redundancies and help, improve communication. But some people are saying it doesn't go far enough. So, for example, the USDA is still not under the same umbrella. They're governed by 2 completely different offices and work separately. So, as you can see in our case, where it's half regulated by FDA, half regulated by USDA, where they're completely 2 different branches of our government, which makes it complicated. So there's some folks who are saying, it's very positive, more emphasis on food safety, of course, is fantastic, but it maybe hasn't gone far enough to bring the agencies together and prevent that kind of redundancy. And then another thing that happened recently was Biden's executive order about the biotechnology and the bioeconomy. So I personally was really excited to see our category of products included in this conversation. So there were some very high level meetings, and some of our member companies were actually invited to the White House to speak about the potential for cell culture products to contribute to our society in general and also to the economy. So the executive order put together some guidelines. So one of them is that the regulations will be looked at. So we want to promote this industry. However, it's highly regulated, both for, what we're trying to do in food and what we're trying to do, other industries are trying to do using biotechnology. So the executive order asked the FDA commissioner and the Secretary of Agriculture to look into areas of regulatory ambiguity. So Biden has actually identified that there are certain uncertainties regarding new technologies, and they want to produce a plan for regulatory reform. So I think that's all good news for us, where they're looking at new technologies, where sometimes it's hard to keep up with the pace. Regulations can't keep up with the pace that new technologies are moving. But this order specifically is asking FDA and USDA to look at new food technologies like ours and to make recommendations for how the regulatory pathway can keep up and to facilitate, the growth of new technologies and, the impact that would have on the economy. So all very exciting stuff.
Yeah, very much. And, creating quite the jealousy moment for Europe in a lot of ways, right? First the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the biotechnology order. There's the center of gravity feels like it's shifting to the U.S. in a lot of ways. So been helpful for us to light a fire under some of our counterparts in Europe. Peter, I wanted to come back to you. You mentioned Korea and the sandbox and some creative things going on there. I also understand that in terms of looking at SFA as a model, there's some activity around New Zealand and Australia as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Robert. I mean, I think in general terms, I think there's a tremendous amount of events happening in the region. First of all, in many countries that typically are dormant in the space. So they're really starting up after COVID. So the industry is really starting to boom here with optimistic in the tech region. So that's very happy. We're going to Malaysia and Jakarta and China. They're all starting up quite strongly. So I sort of mentioned the Korea just now with the MOU. I think that's a really interesting, and we can see in the last few months a strong government involvement, academic involvement, but also coupled by the industry itself there. They already have some 8+ cultivated food companies in Korea, a quite sizable amount. But also, this is a process to collectively collaborate in the sense of to build the industry and the ecosystem together, right? So the MFDS in Korea has really, taken a stance to go forward and establish a pathway for further advancement in the regulatory space, especially with the test zone there, right? Moving on to Australia and New Zealand, I think there was a few months ago the food ministers meeting in Australia and New Zealand. They accepted the current sort of the existing food standards code and labeling requirements in there in Australia and New Zealand as a suitable equipped to regulate cultivated food products there. So this will go under the standards of 1.5.1 novel food standards and 1.5.2, which is the food produced using in technology. So following this, the question is how to go about this from a practical perspective relevant to the companies, right? So this is where, like I say, my own associations are currently supporting, the efforts of Cellular Agriculture Australia, which has really done great work to start up this process there, which is the ecosystem builder in domestically, right? So, we are really in support of the project that currently regarding cultivated food regulations and dossier building assistance for the food companies interested in the Australian market. So essentially, we're producing a management system tailored to clear and consistent pathway to help clear regulations. So it's quite a comprehensive work that is currently being undertaken in Australia to assist companies there. So I highly recommend to take further investigation if you're interested in the Australian Indian market. You can reach out to me or you can reach out to the CA team. I think SA is also in the progress of developing more of a widespread collaboration effort in the region. Following the formation of the Global Alliance, which I think it's really right now the time to do so. the COVID, finally moving on, but also have countries here have sort of graduated to the stage which regulatory assistance and coordination become more relevant. Couple that with more and more industry type of association being involved. So essentially, it will become a platform to connect the various jurisdictions together here for transparent dialogues and collaboration. But more on that maybe in the latter half of 2023. I think quite interesting news is from Israel as well, with the labeling from a religious perspective, right? We're talking about food being considered as cultivated food mentioned by the chief rabbi, right? And how it's going to be put forth as a religious or whether it's going to be kosher or not. But generally, they have a cultivated food is quite supported from a religious perspective there, and I think we see that more and more trends, not only from the people in Israel, but also Halal and so forth, right? So labeling is sort of extending the viewpoint to more religious labeling as well, and I think this applies to any region, but the FAO report will probably come out shortly. And naturally, this is very exciting news, but maybe I will mention more about that in a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue. I mean, one of the things you mentioned is there's so many countries starting to talk about, they're reaching a point where they've either got a startup or they're watching what's happening around the world, and there's these platforms starting to develop. But in reality, we're talking about a fraction of the countries around the world out of hundreds of countries that still aren't talking about this. And that's sort of for our industry, the vanguard, right? Is what are the countries that are going to be needing to develop regulatory structure in the next 5 and 10 years. And luckily, there is some precedent for setting up sort of guidelines and a model through the Codex Alimentarius process. I wanted to kind of transition to that and start talking about international bodies that we're all working with. Maybe a little bit of context first, because codex is not a word that normal people have ever heard or used. The Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is based in Rome and is Latin for the Food Code Commission, was created in the 60s. It's a partnership between the FAO and the World Health Organization, and they focus on creating international standards and guidelines and codes of practice to protect consumers, but and ensure fair practices in food trade. And the Codex standards, they're used worldwide to really harmonize national food safety standards. And many countries who, on a new technology, may not have any legislation on the books for regulation will look at Codex as a model for how to adapt their national food laws in harmonization with global structures. Of course, Codex announced a couple of years ago that they needed to update their rules around quote unquote new foods or novel foods, ours included, which kicked off a process at the FAO to develop some standards around safety. Peter, I'll come back to you quickly because you were actually appointed to the expert panel, as you just referenced, which has been meeting to offer some assistance and guidelines. Will you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I think the expert consultation was held in Singapore last year, and there was 15 member nations participating. I was privileged to be one of them. I think in general terms, the report that will follow from this expert consultation will, have a significant bearing on the course of development and the regulatory sphere. In 2023, encourage more nations to follow suit and guidance, especially in relevance to Codex Alimentarius. So holistically, I can mention about the report. I think it puts forth sort of a tone that towards most of draws a lot of parallels to that of conventional agriculture and standard management systems for risk mitigation, for example, regarding hazards. But naturally, it also deals with more of the new type of production processes, including novel substances, right? So, but in this, I think the general consensus among the many of the experts is that the current established practices that are here today are sufficient to control the hazards without much, without further going into detail. So, in summary, I believe the report is due to come anytime in the first half of 2023, and there will probably be another milestone for the industry. There are currently some background papers online, so please visit that. But we're waiting with excitement.
Yeah, that's great. And so, that's what I gathered. The report's not public yet, but what I've gathered from it is that there's general consensus that the tools that Noreen, you're very familiar with, like HACCP, and current risk mitigation methods are going to be adequate to manage our industry, which is good to hear. As I understand the process, so this will be the fourth report that they've produced, probably the longer one, and then they'll be combined into one larger report, which will be the document that I think Codex really uses this for their next steps. Which brings up something I think we've all talked about before. One of the challenges that we've faced at Cellular Agriculture Europe with Codex is it's an official body that represents 188 member countries and the EU. And there's a couple of hundred official recognized observers, NGOs, Good Food Institute is one, thankfully. And we applied for observer status as an industry association, and we were actually denied because they said we were too new, which I think is kind of a thick irony, considering the technology is brand new. Of course, we're a new industry association, but our voice as an industry has sort of been shut out of this process. And I'm wondering what the two of your organizations have done to try to make sure that it'll be heard in the Codex process in the final report. Noreen, maybe start with you.
Sure. So as you mentioned, GFI is an observer organization, and I also share your sentiment, thank goodness. So, we have AMPS has a close relationship with GFI and, work together when they're getting ready to submit comments or when they're participating in meetings. So we understand what's happening. But I also share your frustration in that, we're kind of shut out of the conversation. I'm really glad that Peter was part of the expert committee, but for the most part, industry is not part of what's going on. And I think the reason is because it is so new. So, the framework that Codex has in place isn't flexible to support new technologies. But what we're doing is, paying close attention to the activities and working through our relationship with GFI to influence as much as we can.
I mean, I fully agree with Noreen and follow suit with her comments. I think from our perspective, we are also trying to be working as much as we can with FAO and building the report. In Singapore, we also part of assisting driving forth the first standard building here for the cultivated food industry. So, SFA is also part of this process, which are part of Codex. So indirectly, we can put forth our viewpoints in that regards, and we can build it from another angle, I think. So that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to operate under the assumption that our panel discussion was so exciting that a bunch of the Codex staff have logged on today and they're watching, and it's our opportunity to speak directly to them. So let's take a couple of minutes and do a quick round robin. And talk about the thing. In a perfect world, what's your wish list for sort of standardized regulations of our industry? Peter, you go first.
I mean, I think I believe what SFA has been doing quite well. They have started an effort towards collaboration. I think to a certain degree, they've mentioned about areas, about ideas of having more widespread continuation of the SFA roundtable, for example, which I think generally in terms is a natural step beyond what has been created thus far. So my wish list is essentially to expand upon that, thinking along the lines of how we can expand upon and the reach. So like I said, we have formalized a regulatory committee who will drive this forth collectively in partnership with the key industry players and agencies with the idea of to create a platform for collaboration here regionally, not the global alliance, but in the APEC region. Collaboration, coordination, information sharing, and synergy and equivalency, right, to a certain degree across the various jurisdictions here. So that is really my wish list, and I think we really have to put into practice and create tangible results. Everyone's talking about regulatory coordination and harmonization, but now we have to put something and make it a reality. So that's my 2023 and onwards plan.
Noreen?
So I can think of a couple of things. So I think the first thing I'm thinking of is very along the lines of what Peter is saying. So having more like mutual recognition agreements or equivalencies between countries would be super important for these products, because it would help us speed things to market and also reduce the burden on the regulatory agencies around the world. So I can really appreciate what Peter was saying about in the Asia Pacific region. we're at my company, Blue Olive, we're working on seafood. And in my position, I'm working on figuring how we can introduce these products in multiple countries, and each one is a different pathway. So it's a tremendous amount of work and information that I have to put together, and I'm repeating it for every country that we want to commercialize in. So if we had these mutual recognition agreements in place, we could recognize each other's food safety assessments, we could recognize each other's GMP systems, and be able to share the information. And they really, they have examples of these in other industries, like specifically, I worked in pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals have a lot of mutual recognition agreements. If we could have the same thing for food, it would facilitate market access. It would encourage harmonization overall. And so some of the things that I think that these agreements do is, one, they would reduce the duplication. So right now, there's somebody in Singapore and Korea and the US and eventually in Europe is looking at the same exact set of information. And if they're able to accept the dossiers that were submitted and approved in other countries, it would go a long way. And it allows the inspectional authorities or the regulatory authorities to really focus. They don't have to do another review. And it also reduces the cost for manufacturers. So if it was harmonized and there was one even if the application or the information in the application was similar, that would significantly reduce the burden on companies. So I think that is a huge part of my wish list. And another part I think that I already discussed was this idea of the pre-consultation meeting. So there's, certain countries will allow companies to meet with regulators and talk to them about the technology and, how we're trying to assess safety. And in particular with a new technology, that's super important because it helps the regulators understand what the key issues are and helps the companies at the same time understand the expectations. And with a brand new technology, that's not, you're not able to do that in advance. So if you, put the dossier or submit the dossier, let's say in the EFSA framework, it will take far longer if there hasn't been any kind of pre-consultation process. So I think it benefits both the regulators and the industry because regulators understand the technology, understand the ins and outs and the things that they have to pay attention to in their assessment. And at the same time, it informs the companies what the expectations are. And so by the time that document reaches the regulator's desk, both parties are informed and it's a higher quality submission. It's a higher likelihood of being approved or accepted, and it increases or decreases, I should say, the amount of time it takes for the product to get to market. So I think the pre-consultation process is invaluable. And I would say in general, whatever country that's putting a framework together, I think that would be on my wish list.
Yeah, I endorse all of those 100%. I have two quick things and then I'll see if we'll have time for a question. I would like to see more coherence between public policy goals of a country and the regulatory structure. There's a lot of people applying with novel food dossiers for a range of products, things like CBD, related edibles, for example, that put a backlog on a system on limited resources by these civil servants. And if, for example, a country has a strong commitment to climate goals and the Paris Climate Accord, I would like to see that tied to civil servants having the power to give priority to approval of products that make sense for the goals for the country at a larger scale. And of course, pre-submission consultation. We have less than a minute left. I can't see the question, so maybe the moderator can point a question to us if there is one.
Yes, there is, Robert. So I'll put this question to all of you from Hannah Lester. It's a really great question. So she says, hi, Robert and panel, fantastic discussion. In your opinion, how realistic is the harmonization for cellular agriculture? And what are the risks of harmonization if it were to become a reality? So if each of you want to have a stab at that before we round up.
5 seconds. Mixed chances of full results, but I think we have to strive towards it and at least lift up the highest common denominator, like pre-submission consultation around the world.
Thank you. And Noreen?
I think she's on mute.
You're on mute.
Yeah, maybe I can step in
Yeah.
really quick between. But I fully agree with Robert. I think that, harmonization is a goal we can aim for, and then we will add upon coordination, which I think will be sufficient. So, it's a process. So, but I think it will become a reality in the future.
Fabulous. Thank you. And Noreen, what would you like to add to that?
Sorry, I lost the audio connection briefly. So I think it's an interesting question to talk about the risk. I mostly just think about the benefits. So I think it's a high goal to achieve, and we, in reality, we may never get there. We may never get to full harmonization. But I think having the conversation and talking about it really brings the issues to the forefront and helps promote understanding across the world and across regions. So it creates a kind of harmonization by a convergence of ideas, and puts information out there into the public sphere to help people understand. So we may never achieve it, but I hope and believe that we can. And I don't really think of it as a risk. I just think there's all benefits.
Fabulous. Well, that brings us to the end of the session. It was such a rich and engaging conversation. Thank you so much. And Robert, fantastic facilitation from yourself. We did have lots of questions coming in. So if you would like your question answered by the panel, please contact them directly through the platform, and I'm sure that they would love to receive those from you. So I hope you have enjoyed what you've heard this morning at the Future of Protein Production Summit. We're now going to have a 30-minute networking break. So don't forget to take a look at the sponsors section, featuring, among others, our IP partner, HGF, our protein ingredient partner, Enough, and our regulation partner, Penn and Tech Consulting. There's also dedicated lounges for our platinum sponsors, Benson Hill and Closure, and all of the other exhibitors who have sponsored the event this year. And please remember that with this platform, you can join one of the networking lounges and meet with other delegates over a coffee. Just click the networking lounges button in the tab at the top of the page and choose which lounge or subject that you would like to join. So we'll see you back here in 30 minutes time at 2 p.m. GMT. See you then. Bye-bye.